Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of the United States and the Cold War. As described in the previous lecture, by the summer of 1951, the Korean War had devolved into a stalemate between the United States and UN and South Korean forces on one side, and North Korean and Chinese forces on the other. Again, hovering around the 38th parallel, where North and South Korea had been divided before the war. It remained in a bloody standoff for nearly the next 2 years, before finally settling into peace, as I'll describe momentarily. By that time, in 1952, the United States had elected a new president, Dwight Eisenhower, and said goodbye to Harry Truman, who had become increasingly unpopular in the late stages of his presidency. Eisenhower campaigned on ending the war in Korea, and shortly after taking office, he did just that. In July of 1953, Eisenhower signed the peace treaty, establishing the boundary at the 38th parallel, close to the old line, and establishing a demilitarized zone between the two. And yet it wasn't a formal peace treaty, rather an armistice, whereby both sides laid down their weapons and agreed not to keep fighting. So it was truly an imperfect settlement at the end of the war. In this lecture, I'll talk further about the end of the war and its impact into the years and decades after. Historians have debated whether the United States accomplished anything with their intervention into Korea. Was the mission a success? Was it a failure? Well, it depends on what the goals were in that time. If the goal was to unify and unite Korea under a democratic form of government, then obviously it was a failure. If the goal was simply to limit the war and stop communist expansion, then we might consider it a success. But with the way the war ended, after the Chinese incursion and American forces forced into a disorganized and chaotic retreat by 33 divisions of Chinese troops, in some ways it felt on the home front like a defeat. The bottom line is it was a civil war, not directly tied to the United States and Soviet Cold War, but American leaders, and Harry Truman in particular, interpret it as a Cold War threat. The war indicated the limitations of containment. It was very difficult to win a war like this. It was very difficult to gain any ground. If the objectives are defensive and to simply contain communism, then how do we even bring an end to a conflict like this? We will see very similar issues playing out in even more complicated fashion in the Vietnam War a bit later in the course. So let's assess some of the costs and the effects of this war. Well, I mentioned early on, it's regarded in the United States as the forgotten war, but it's certainly not forgotten in Korea and in China and elsewhere. It cost perhaps 4 million Korean lives or more. As a civil war, of course, the great majority of casualties were those living in Korea. Also, somewhere around 400,000 Chinese were killed during the war. Many, many others, of course, were wounded and maimed. And some 40,000 United Nations troops, the great majority of which were American forces. So again, for this war to be forgotten, while the Vietnam War is very much remembered with only a few more American casualties, is regrettable. And there was also the cost of the war in terms of dollars, in which the United States spent some $20 billion to fight this war. The war had sweeping effects that lingered into the years and even decades after, throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. So I'll talk about a number of these effects. On one hand, it helped to fuel Eisenhower's rise to power. Again, I mentioned that one of Eisenhower's campaign platforms was to bring an end to the war in Korea. He won the election, and then in short order, he did indeed bring an end to the war in Korea. And so this was a very powerful testament to him as a leader and as president. It also helped to fuel McCarthyism and the Red Scare on the American home front, which is the topic of the next lecture in this course. And we'll talk about how events abroad, like the Korean War, very much influenced events on the home front. It also, in broad terms, increased the power of the president. Harry Truman was able effectively to wage this entire war without ever calling on Congress to formally declare war. And again, we'll talk about similar things with Vietnam later in the course. The war also signified a deterioration in the relationship between the United States and China, which of course had already been on the decline. And in the meantime, Japanese-American relations improved during this time, and so we were clearly beginning to align ourselves with Japan in the Asian theater. The decision to take the war beyond the 38th parallel into North Korea and up to the border with China perhaps unnecessarily alienated the Chinese and forced them to respond. Relations with China would be rocky for at least the next 20 years, and in some ways continue to be even today. As one observer of this development noted at that time, 700 million potential customers had turned into the apparition of 700 million dangerous adversaries. The Korean War also, of course, dramatically increased the size of the American army, which grew to about 3.5 million men at the height of this war. And so, overall, it is indicative of the growing militarization of the Cold War, which I described in a previous lecture. We begin pushing for the hydrogen bomb and experimenting with smaller tactical nuclear weapons. This is also a time when the B-52 bomber is being developed. Nuclear submarines are beginning to be tested and developed. And in late 1950, Truman submitted a budget, including a defense allotment, of more than $50 billion, an increase from only $13 billion the year before. NSC 68 is being put into action, the defense budget is growing, and from this point forward, we will perpetually be on a wartime budget. Korea was the first major military engagement of the Cold War, and there would be others. So the Korean War in some ways suggests things to come. United States policies were almost paranoid of communist expansion, and many times over the duration of the Cold War, the United States will intervene where there appears to be the threat of communism, where American intervention in hindsight might have been unnecessary. It becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between a civil war, the rise of communism, and potential Soviet involvement. And again, the Eisenhower presidency really struggled with many civil wars around the globe. It was also difficult to win a clear victory under these circumstances. It was difficult at times to know what our goals were, and so it was difficult to know if we were meeting those goals. At the same time, the continued military buildup and the threat of a possible nuclear war will become greater and greater as the years went on, as both sides had more and more powerful weapons. This also played a role in increasing the psychology of fear on the home front, which again we'll talk about in the next lecture. I would also note once again that the end of this war was an armistice, not a formal peace treaty. And so while both sides laid down their weapons and stopped the fighting and agreed not to resume the fighting, there still remains, even to this day, the possibility of an outbreak of conflict in Korea. And Korea remains even now a hotspot of concern in the world. So after the Korean War, the United States began to realize how the Cold War would play out. There is neither peace nor war, but we must be prepared for whatever could erupt at any moment around the world. After World War II, the military budget had been reduced, and there was a de-escalation. But with Korea, there's a new wartime budget, and moving forward, the United States would maintain a very high defense budget every single year. This, on the one hand, stimulated the American economy through military contracts and preparations for war. At the same time, it seemed at any moment there might be the threat of the outbreak of violence and war and potentially even nuclear annihilation. And so, while the Korean War ends with a settlement and a sort of peace at the 38th parallel, it also signals to the United States and others around the world that we would never again remain entirely in peace.